All right, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Dave Weiner, and I'm the Program Director for Bay Area ICOR here at UC Berkeley. Thank you all for joining this NSF SBIR webinar. Whether you are a startup founder who is planning to submit an NSF SBIR in the near future, or really just anyone who might want to learn a little bit more about non-dilutive funding opportunities, you are in the right place. I am very excited to be joined today by Kirk Macolini. Kirk is the founder and president of InteliSpark, a consulting firm that does an absolutely wonderful job of helping and supporting startups and companies to secure non-dilutive funding, such as the SBIR. So Kirk, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to join us today, share your knowledge. We appreciate it so much. And if you are ready, I will pass the floor to you to kick things off.
Thanks, Dave. All right, so thanks for the quick introduction. Let me just share my screen. I will say that if you have questions that are relevant to what we're talking about at the time, feel free to throw them in the chat, and Dave will make his best decision whether to interrupt me or not. I think it makes for a better presentation to be more interactive if necessary. So I basically run a company called InteliSpark. What we do is we help companies win SBIRs, STTR proposals primarily. We want a lot of them, obviously. This is just sort of, 500 projects closing in on $300 million in non-dilutive funding. A fair amount of those, you know what, I'm sliding the wrong presentation to an old version. Hang on one second. This one.
And as Kirk pulls that up, a quick reminder, just echo what I just said. If you do have any questions that he goes, please just drop them in the chat. I'll keep an eye out for them and flag them, and makes for great interaction. So please, any questions, drop them in the chat.
Okay, so yeah, so we basically have done over 500 funded projects, close to $300 million in funding at this point. We do help about 40 to 45 companies every year successfully get funding, and a lot of them have really good exits. So SBIR and STTR funding are the sort of biggest source of non-dilutive funding for startups, and I'll talk a little about that. If you've ever seen what I'll call an SBIR 101 presentation, this will be a lot different than that, because I try to spend a lot less time on the things that you can Google for yourself in 10 minutes and more on things that actually add value to your success rate. So first of all, why do you even care? The reality is, if you can go out tomorrow and raise $10–15 million, please do. It's a much faster pathway. Generally, people who are interested in non-dilutive funding, you're trying to sort of get funding at a time when you have a lot more risk than traditional investors will want, and primarily technical risk. So you're too risky, too early, unproven team, technology, market, etc. And so the federal government decided to sort of create the SBIR program, which is meant to bridge the valley of death, which is between sort of basic R&D at the university level and venture capital investment. And they spend a little over $4 billion a year currently on the SBIR program. Generally, the way it works is it's mandated by Congress. There is a 3.2% of the total R&D budget of all the major federal agencies has to be set aside for SBIRs, and 0.45% of their budget for STTRs. And I'll get into the difference between the two programs in a minute. But the important thing to understand is Congress mandates this. It works like a tax. And so SBIR and STTR budgets rise and fall with general federal R&D budgets. Basically, there's some high-level eligibility criteria, which I'm sure everyone in this room probably has no problem with. You have to be a for-profit U.S. business. There is a ownership rule, which is important, which is you're 51% owned by US individuals, which is defined as citizens and or green card holders, or other small businesses that meet the same criteria. And you have to be independently operated. NIH and ARPA-E will allow you to be 51% owned by multiple US VC firms, but I suspect that's no one in this room. You have to be located in the US. You have to have a principal investigator whose primary employment is with the small business. That's defined as being 51% or more employed by the small business, and also means you can't work more than 19.5 hours anywhere else. NIH will allow the PI to come from the university on an STTR, which is the one exception to that rule. Weirdly enough, the size standard for a small business is actually 500 employees, which probably for all of you seems like it's pretty gigantic, but that's the way it is. And then finally, for the most part, all the work has to be done in the US. There is a process for a waiver, but it's extremely difficult to get. And it's only granted in cases where you have research that can only be done outside of the US. Imagine you're working on a tropical disease and you're running a clinical trial and it doesn't really occur in the US, so you have to do it somewhere else. Okay. Two different programs, SBIR, STTR, but essentially they're almost exactly the same with the exception of where the work has to be done. So the SBIR requires that the small business do 2/3 of the work during phase 1 and half the work during phase 2, meaning 1/3 can be subawarded out during phase 1 and half during phase 2. STTR mandates a university partner. The university partner has to do at least 30% in both phases, and the small business has to do at least 40%. The remaining 30 can go to one, the other, or third parties. Now, STTR is small business technology transfer. Despite tech transfer being in the name, there's no requirement that you actually do tech transfer. So for the projects we do, more often than not, the university is an evaluative role as opposed to a tech transfer role. So imagine that you have a small molecule and you want someone to, run animal experiments on it. Oftentimes, the university is a good source of that. You can do that as a part of an STTR, but no tech transfer is actually taking place. Okay. All right, who has programs? So there are 5 large agencies: the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, NASA, Department of Energy, and then Health and Human Services, which includes NIH, CDC, and FDA, who have both an SBIR and an STTR program. And those 5 agencies account for the lion's share of the funds. And then there are 6 smaller agencies: Homeland Security, the USDA, EPA, Department of Transportation, Education, and Commerce, who have only an SBIR program, and they're much, much smaller. So the program is structured as a 3-phase program. Phase 1 is sort of what I'll call crawling, then phase 2 walking, and then phase 3 running. Now, the important thing to understand is everything you hear about budgets and dollars is all ish, because it's very different depending upon where you're going. So the smallest phase 1s right now are the Air Force, which are about $50,000. The largest phase 1 that I've done in recent years is $700,000. Smallest phase 2s are $400,000 at the EPA. The largest phase 2 I've ever done is about $6 million. So there's a lot of variability in what's allowed, depending on the agency, possibly the topic. And so these are all just kind of generalish numbers. So generally, phase 1 on average is about 150 across agencies on an agency average. But on a more project average, the bigger agencies usually have something closer to $250,000 for phase 1. And it's generally 6 months for an SBIR or 12 months for an STTR. Phase 2 is generally $1 million or more, where agencies like NIH will typically be at $2 million. NSF is $1 million. The DoD kind of depends upon which part of the DoD you're in. And then phase 3 really just means non-SBIR funding. So that could be private funded, non-SBIR federal funds, or any other source that doesn't include SBIR funds. Okay. Okay. Most importantly, to understand is how to actually use these programs effectively to grow your business, not just win grants. Okay, so the first thing I'll say is there's no scenario where you just use solely non-dilutive funding and have a massive success. I've had, tons of companies with large exits. Every single one of them combined private and public money. And so if you think that you can just solely raise non-dilutive funding and keep all your company, you're sadly mistaken. And I'll pretty happily bet my house against you. So understand that non-dilutive funding is part of your funding strategy and not a sole funding strategy. So basically, what SBIR program allows you to do is really reduce risk to advance your technology, therefore allowing you to bring on investors, partners, early customers, and potentially employees as well. And so it's really just a step in the road to de-risk you to allow you to actually move forward. Okay. So there are a number of companies that actually are massively successful that have started out with SBIR funds. So here's basically 4 companies you've probably all heard of. Combined total about $20 million in SBIR funding. Obviously, great ROI for the government. There are also a small army of companies that do nothing other than win SBIRs. Please don't be one of these companies. The fact that a company has won 1,000, at this point, 1,700 SBIR awards between their phase 1s and phase 2s is insane. And that really shouldn't be something you're trying to emulate, because ultimately, probably none of you have heard of any of these companies. And this just kind of shows like the companies that sort of go on this pathway. This is the largest company here with SBIR awards. It just becomes a drug they can't get off of. And so it never ends. Okay. So first thing you have to do is figure out who to get the money from. So there's 11 different agencies, and understand that every agency is completely unique. Other than some basic rules set by Congress and the Small Business Administration, they're allowed to do whatever they want, which means each agency is unique in the kinds of R&D that they'll fund, the dollar amounts that they have, the receipt dates and timing of their proposals, their review process, success rates, how they award things versus contract and grant, and a million other differences. And so when let's say you're working on an NSF project, and you have a friend who's working on an NIH proposal, whatever he knows doesn't really apply to you. And if you try to cross that knowledge, you're going to make a lot of mistakes you shouldn't make. Okay, so generally, as I said earlier, the 5 large agencies account for most of the money. And so generally, you're trying to figure out how to make what you're doing of interest to one of those 5 agencies. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't get money from the 6 smaller ones, but generally it's just easier to go where there's more money, though that is not always the case. So this is a non-SBIR example, but it's a great example. So back in 2010, as part of the stimulus bill, NIH got $200 million to fund what they call challenge projects, $1 million apiece, going after interesting challenges in public health. Based on the same bill, the Department of Defense got $100 million to do something pretty similar. And so NIH publicized the hell out of it everywhere you went, and it was open to everybody, universities, small businesses, etc. And the DoD was open to everybody as well, but they only just published it in the one place they're required to and let the chips fall where they may. And so it became pretty obvious pretty quickly that everyone was going after challenge grants, so we didn't do any of them. But the DoD operational medicine grants had almost no attention. And the end result was the DoD got 24,000 applications for their 200 awards, while the Department of Defense got 800 applications for their 100 awards. So it should be pretty obvious that there's no reality where being, in a bucket where you're sub 1% probability makes any sense for anybody. And so you want to look at not just how much money is available, but also what the applicant flow rates look like as well. So when you're picking agencies, you have to fall into a topic. And so the way the agencies sort of solicit topics is dramatically different, and they are on a spectrum from what I call open topics to narrow topics. So open topics, the classic example would be NSF. If you go to the NSF webpage, you'll see they have about 35 topic areas. And there are things like biomedical technologies. And within them is a bunch of subtopics, which sort of further divide that to give people ideas of things that they're interested in. But the last subtopic is always something like other biomedical technologies. You go to the energy area, there's an other energy technologies topic. And even at the high level, there is a topic called other technologies. So NSF will basically fund almost anything under the sun, as it won't sort of discriminate against your technology domain. There are a couple of exceptions. They don't like to do things, well, they will not do things that involve a clinical trial. And And so as soon as you do anything that intervenes with the patient and measure that is a clinical trial, and they won't touch it. And then generally also there are a few weird areas, like if you're doing research involving like drugs that are regulated by the DEA, they won't actually touch that as well. But generally, technology is wide open. On the other end of the spectrum, the narrow side, the classic example is the Department of Defense, who they have very, very specific requirements, where they might say, I want a brand new battery, has to have an energy density of X, cycle life of Y, etc. And so this really comes to be a double-edged sword either way. So the advantage of the open topics is it's very easy to find a home. The advantage of the narrow topic is generally the agencies, when they have narrow topics, it's because they're procurement agencies and they actually want to buy that. So if you're successful going through the process, phase 1, phase 2, and beyond, you may be creating a very large customer for yourself as well. So next thing to understand is like what the schedule generally looks like. So over the course of the year, proposals come out, the fiscal year starts in October, and then solicitations come out left and right, and then they're sort of due a few months later. The vast bulk of the awards are issued in the middle of summer, whereas the last bunch of proposals actually go in, let's say, between October and April, whereas most proposals are actually due. So now is actually a very good time to be thinking about your SBIR efforts. It's important to understand these aren't random drawings. There's a ton of work goes into this. And so one of the most important things is to make sure you're actually going after high probability opportunities, and matching up agency to topic area is probably one of the most important areas to sort of look at. And I'll go over some examples in a minute that kind of explain how you can actually create probability sort of out of nowhere. In that line, it's important to understand when you think about these agencies, the agencies are not monolithic. So if I take something like the Department of Defense, it's actually carved up into a bunch of sub-agencies: the Navy, the Army, Missile Defense, Air Force, DARPA, and a bunch of smaller offices. If I go down to the Navy, well, actually the Navy is divided up into a bunch of commands. And so it's ONR, NAVC, SPAWAR, etc. And in this case, like award amounts can be different between these commands. And so not only is there differentiation at the agency level, there's also differentiation at the sub-agency and then even sub-agency level, which creates a lot of variability in the program about what you can do, what can be funded, how much the awards are, timing, etc. So matching up with a topic generally seems obvious, but the thing to understand is the federal government is always inefficient. So usually, if one person in the federal government might fund a project, that usually means there's 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 that are interested in funding a similar project. And your task is to find the person who gives you the highest probability of funding your project. For most of you, the important thing to understand is that NSF is going to be your best bet early on. They are very startup friendly. So the vast chunk of their awards go to companies that have 10 or fewer employees. Almost all of them have never won a phase 2 SBIR award, and the vast bulk of them are actually incorporated within the last 5 years. Generally, NSF will fund a company one time. You win a phase 1, you win a phase 2, they'll never fund you again in most cases. That's very different than a lot of other agencies. They'll fund the same company over and over and over and over again. Now, if you go to NSF and you win a phase 1 and you do not win a phase 2, then you can sort of backtrack and win you can go back to phase 1 and start again, and then try to get a phase 2 from there. But once you want a phase 2, they're kind of done with you. It's also important to understand that solicitation schedules play a big role. And so here's an example at NIH. So NIH has 3 cycles a year: January, April, and September. And it creates a curious effect. So when you look at generally NIH proposals, every cycle, there's a bunch of resubmissions from a previous cycle, and there's also new submissions. January is interesting because the deadline is always January 5th, which means a lot of people get to about December 23rd and they decide to bail on their projects and end up punting them till April. And so there's just a lower volume of proposals in January. In April, because there's only 3 months between January and April, the projects that get submitted in January do not get reviews back in time to resubmit them in April. So those resubmissions get pushed forward to September. And then in September, you actually have 5 months of time to build up applications, plus 3 of those are summer months where a lot of academically affiliated companies have a lot of free time. And so they end up with a much higher volume of proposals in September. And so therefore, when proposal volume goes up, review sort of quality goes down because reviewers get a lot more proposals to review. We've seen this effect before historically when NSF was on a 2 deadline structure. So where is every June, they would get a much higher volume of proposals than they would in December, because December was an early December deadline, June was a late June deadline, and you would get, because December 1st, academic calendar is still in full swing, you get a reduced level of proposals, whereas in June, most universities wrap up in early May. Again, you have free time on the academic side, therefore you get more applications going that way. We've also noticed, like during the pandemic, the proposal volume rate went way up throughout the pandemic. And that's just because, and we can measure that by the number of project pitches that are actually submitted each cycle. And so economic events will actually impact your success rate. So right now, proposal volume is going to start creeping up pretty dramatically because companies that are trying to raise money are going to discover that it's very difficult to raise money in the current situation. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about NIH because it's kind of a unique agency in the fact that it's very open as far as the data that's available. So you can get a really good, interesting view of how interagency differences can create probabilities sort of out of nowhere. So NIH is actually chopped up into 27 different sub-institutes, all with their own independent budgets and also independent rates of success and volume of proposals. And so in a given year, what we see is that success rates across those institutes will range somewhere in the sort of low to mid single digits to up into the 30 or 40%. And so obviously, if you could be on the right side of this chart instead of the left side, you're creating a lot of probability. And what's interesting is your proposal review is done at an NIH level, and then it gets assigned to the institute. So if you get a better institute of assignment, you'll end up with a better probability of getting funded. Just based on that, it won't affect the review process and who reviews it. It's also important to note that success rates is not a direct correlation to probability. So the way NIH works, proposals come in, they get reviewed. The bottom half sort of gets triaged and doesn't get scored. The top half gets discussed and scored. Scores go from 10 to 90, 10 is the best, 90 is the worst. And some parts of NIH publish what's called a pay line, which means any number at that or below gets funded. So what you would expect is that the pay line would grow as probability grows, but it doesn't quite work that way because some parts of NIH just also happen to get a lot of low quality proposal. And it's just sort of a historical thing. Like NIMS, which is arthritis and musculoskeletal and skin disorders, they get a bunch of weird proposals like about therapeutic massage that have no chance of getting funded. And so even though success rate is relatively low, the pay line that you need to get above score-wise is actually relatively good. And so it's not a direct correlation between probability and success rate. So when you look at success rate, one of the challenges is to not figure out what success rate was, but what success rate will be in the future. So every, let's call it spring, NIH publishes success rates across those institutes, and it looks something like this. And so when you look at this, you can see 2 different agencies within NIH, NIDCR, which is dental and craniofacial diseases, and NIEHS, which is environmental health sciences. And so I chose these because on the surface, they look like essentially equivalent agencies as far as success rate. You basically have about a 30% chance of winning a phase 1 and about a 50% chance of winning phase 2. And so if you had the opportunity to sort of submit to either one, you'd probably say it doesn't really matter, and maybe there's some slight preference to NIDCR. Now, when I look at these numbers, I see two dramatically different things. These agencies are not at all equivalent, and that's because this is backward-looking data, and the data that's here influences future data. And so what I look at is the ratio of phase 1 awards to phase 2 proposals. And so what you can see in the top example is there were far more phase 1 awards than there were phase 2 proposals. And therefore, when you look forward, you're expecting those phase 1 awards to be applying for phase 2, dramatically changing the sort of funding landscape because you have a lot of large budget projects coming in to get funded. Whereas in the bottom example, the number of phase 1 awards was very similar to the number of phase 2 proposals. And so I expect their success rates to maintain relative stability. And so when I see these numbers, I think NIEHS is a much better place to go versus NIDCR. So what I'm trying to do is sort of extrapolate past events to sort of figure out what future success rates will be. And what will happen is, in this case, NIDCR success rates will drop like a rock when all these phase 1 projects try to go for phase 2. So, and this is important because what you're trying to do is put yourself in the highest case of being funded, regardless of what your technology is. And so it turns out, again, this goes back to the issue of the government always being inefficient. So here's an example of a company we dealt with. They came to us and they had an intervention for smoking. They wanted to do a National Cancer Institute project. They were like, hey, they have the biggest budget. They have the giant smoking cessation research program. This is what we want to do. And we're like, no, can't do that. Instead, we sent their project to NIDA, which is National Institute on Drug Abuse, which is basically has a budget about 1/5 the size of NCI's, but they also run a small smoking cessation program, and they also don't get a lot of very good proposals. And so ultimately, this project got funded with a score that would have never been funded at NCI. And so it's basically putting it into a higher probability bucket, all of a sudden created a phase 1 and a phase 2 that otherwise would not have existed. Okay, so if you taken nothing away so far, it's to don't just blindly navigate to the obvious place. Try to put some strategy around where your project goes, because if you can take something out of the 5% bucket and put it into the 25% bucket, it's like a magic wand. And there's nothing you can do while writing a proposal that generates probability quite as effectively. Okay, so once you kind of figure out where you want to go, next thing you have to do is sort of scope out a project. And it's really important to understand your own company's step functions as part of this process. I think people kind of view their own value as going up in a linear fashion, like on the left, but in reality, that rarely happens. Generally, what happens is value works more like a staircase, where you sort of do a bunch of work and you have some culminating sort of pivotal experiment, and then all of a sudden your value goes up. So example, if you're developing a drug, your step functions look like, preclinical, clinical, finish to phase 1, finish to phase 2. The fact that you're halfway through a phase 1 clinical trial doesn't add any value. It's only once you're done and you get the sort of result to show that it worked out that it actually has gone on, even though you spent a lot of money to get that far. And so what you want to do is build your SBIRs, both phase 1 and phase 2, around those step functions to maximize value. Now, in general, most agencies will require you to do a phase 1 and then do a phase 2. Some agencies, like NIH, will allow you to do a phase 1, a fast track, which is a combined phase 1, phase 2, or what's called a direct to phase 2. The phase 1 requires the lowest level of preliminary data to be competitive, and it's kind of the base case for most people. A fast track will require slightly more preliminary data because you're actually asking for more money. It also introduced two other potential pitfalls for applicants. One is the way a fast track works is you do the phase 1 portion, you submit a report to the agency says, yeah, they did a great job on phase 1, we're going to now release their phase 2 money. But the reviewers are kind of like maybe suspicious of this process, so they want to see that you actually have hard criteria in advance to sort of gate moving from phase 1 to phase 2. And so if you don't have strong quantitative success criteria, most reviewers will ding your fast track proposal pretty hard. The other challenge of a fast track project is you don't have the benefit of the phase 1 data in designing your phase 2 plans. And so that can lead to lack of clarity and vagueness in your approach, which almost all reviewers hate and will pretty much destroy your application. So if you have a project where you need that phase 1 data to do a good job designing your phase 2 experiments, you're probably not a great candidate for a fast track. And then finally, there is what's called the direct to phase 2, which means you're basically sort of saying you've already done the equivalent of a phase 1 on your own, and now you're going to just jump right to phase 2. The biggest hurdle here is people tend to overestimate the equivalency of a phase 1. And so when you think about a phase 1 that might be anywhere from a quarter to $300,000, have you really done that much work? And is it convincing enough to convince reviewers that you've actually done the equivalent of a phase 1 and established feasibility in advance? Generally, we're pretty bullish on fast track and direct to phase 2 projects for the upcoming fiscal year. And the reason why is we think that this will be the last of the pretty generous federal R&D budgets for a while. There's an election this fall. I suspect that both the House and the Senate are going to change hands, and the federal government spent a lot of money over the last 3 years, and there's going to be probably a pullback. We saw the same thing if you look back to 2008, 9, and 10. Lots of federal spending. Election goes one way. You have what's called the sequester, where R&D budgets got all cut back pretty substantially, and that made money hard to get. The beauty of a fast track or a direct to phase 2 is you're sort of locking in multi-year projects now when money is available and not having to go back and compete for your phase 2 in an environment where funding may be less friendly. One of the things that we talk a lot about is avoiding terminal phase 1s. So over the years, I've had a lot of companies come to me and they're like, hey, I've won 3 phase 1s, but none of them went to phase 2. I don't know what's happening. And we look at their projects and they're what I call terminal phase 1s. And what I mean by that is they're not designed to create the right kind of data to actually win a phase 2. So, and usually that means like they're like, oh, we built a prototype in phase 1. They didn't do an adequate job testing it. So they don't have data on sort of how it actually works and moves the needle and actually addresses their value proposition and how it eliminated the technical risk in phase 1. Instead, they just have this thing that they built. And so in essence, they lost the phase 2 the day they submit their phase 1. They just don't necessarily know that yet. It's also important to understand that there's a disconnect between what's going on commercially and the way reviewers view the world. So when you are thinking about from a company, you're looking at what the market has right now. The reviewers, many of whom will come from the academic world, are not looking at the state of the art, looking at the state of the science. And so, you look out at the market and say, there's nothing out there that does this. This is innovative, this is great. The reviewer says, oh, I saw some paper in some obscure journal that does the same thing. This isn't new. So you have to make sure that you're addressing those issues and understand that you have to build things around maybe a higher bar than what's commercially available right now. Okay. So if you do all this, you scope the project out you want to do, you matched up with an agency that you think will be a good match for you, and now you have to put a proposal together. And so what I'm going to do is try to just give you some things we've learned over the years that are important to being successful, but this is by no means meant to be exhaustive. The first thing to understand is to understand the reviewer's workload. And so generally, reviewers will get somewhere between 5 and 10 proposals. Generally, if you look at the full PDF for a typical phase 1, it's anywhere from 50 to 80 pages. A phase 2, generally, let's call it like 80 to 200 pages. So if I slap down 5, 6, 8, 10 of those, that's an enormous pile of paperwork. And so, and reviewers generally, they get proposals in advance. They're required to sort of read them, write up a review, and then go to a sort of usually an all-day or maybe even all 2-day meeting to sort of have a discussion about those proposals. For their time, they get a couple $100. And so it's an enormous ask for almost no compensation. And so it becomes an inevitably situation where reviewers need to sort of cut the workload on their own to make it more viable. And so what tends to happen is reviewers are trying to find a way to triage projects and say, okay, what are the ones that are just terrible? So I can just skim through them, write some quick comments up and be done. And then what are the ones that I want to focus on and actually read thoroughly? And so it's important to understand reviewers, what I call points of entry. So where do they actually enter and get your first impression? So imagine this is kind of like when you're in the airport and you go to the newsstand, pick up a magazine. You look at the cover, you look at the headlines, you flip through, look at the graphics. If it's interesting, you pick it up and you buy it and you read on the plane. If not, you don't. And so your first page, your title, your abstract, your graphics, all that becomes important in capturing their interest and making them want to read it. If you don't win the battle for sort of attention, you'll get a review back and you'll say, it's like they didn't even read it. And the reality is they didn't, but you didn't actually make them want to read it. So it's your own damn fault. And so you have to make sure that you create an environment where people want to read your proposal more than other proposals. The other thing I tell everyone is that everyone in America is taught to write the wrong way. And there are really two driving dynamics here. First is this idea of writing, what I call writing to space. And so you're in third grade, you get your first writing assignment, it's probably summarizing a book. Your first question is, how long does it have to be? And this question pervades your entire academic career. You get to middle school and they say, write a paper. And you say, how long does it have to be? You get to high school, how long does it have to be? You're always given these papers with length. And the reality is the way the grading system works, you're rewarded for filling those pages. If you write 5 pages of interesting content and you add 5 pages of fluff on a 10-page paper, you'll get a better grade than the person who has 8 pages of interesting content. And so you're always given credit for asking, sort of filling pages, which creates an incredibly inefficient writing style. And in this environment, you're in a one-way communication. If you don't communicate some detail the reviewer wants to know, then you can't go back and just answer that question for them. It becomes sort of, something you get dinged on, costs you points, and you get too many of those, you don't get funded. And so it's important to have space-efficient text that conveys a lot of information and covers a lot of details as possible, particularly in the agencies that have very short formats, like NIH, where for a phase 1, you essentially have 7 pages to describe your science project. And so if you leave out details that reviewers want to know, they'll just give you a mediocre score and you'll end up resubmitting trying to do that right. So you have to write very efficiently. The second thing is there's this classical writing style, which is you have introduction, you build your details, you come to some amazing conclusion. I guarantee you that if you do that in this environment, nobody will ever read your amazing conclusion. You have to think and write more like a newspaper does. So when you read the headline, you know what the story is. Read the first paragraph, you really know the story, and everything else is just kind of filling in details from there. And so I like to say everything important you want to say best be on your first page. In every section, everything important you want to say should be in the first paragraph. In every paragraph, everything important you want to say should be in the first sentence. And then you're adding details from there to sort of give more color to it. But you're constantly fighting the battle for attention and keep them engaged. The other thing that we do, I think that most people do is, most people do is what I call the art of grant writing, which basically means they write a grant, and then they submit it and they get a review and they change it and they get another review and they change it again and again and again over again. And it creates a very linear process. And years ago, I said, well, that's kind of silly because it doesn't actually allow you to learn in a fast way. It takes forever to actually go through 3 or 4 or 5 submissions. So as a company, what we do is a lot of analysis on projects across the board, so that we analyze like reviews from individual agencies and more importantly, individual review panels to see what I call the pulse of the panel. And so therefore I can take learnings from multiple projects and apply them to each project and therefore learn that process much faster. And so basically the idea is to use a lot of data from prior reviews to sort of shape new reviews. So you don't get caught up in the the art of grant writing, instead have a more of a scientific process in how you drive your narratives on a go-forward basis. So generally, Generally, the style of writing a proposal is very similar to what you see in a peer-reviewed journal article. But this should not look like an academic grant. It should not be an academic exploration, but instead is more driven by concrete objectives and measures of success that are dictated by market viability. So in the academic world, you can sort of say, does process X create effect Y? And that's a great grant in the academic world. In the SBIR world, you have to add this critical thing, which is, does process X create effect Y at a minimum threshold of Z, which is defined by what will make it viable in the market? And so everything is driven by creating success that's driven by a threshold that's determined by the market, not just by science on its own. Important to write concisely. Always important to use visuals wherever you can to communicate a lot of information. It captures attention, also going to allow you to sort of communicate a lot of information very effectively. This is particularly important for anyone doing software. Software is the absolutely worst thing to describe. If I asked all of you to describe what PowerPoint does, I would get 50 descriptions and probably still have no idea what PowerPoint does, if you're only allowed to use words. If I allowed you to suddenly use a storyboard, I would get 50 descriptions and I would have a very good idea from almost all of them what PowerPoint does. It's important to have a well-referenced proposal. God forbid that someone who's done something in the field is one of your reviewers and you don't cite their amazing work, they'll kill you for it. And also, you know, there's definitely a subset of reviewers that get incredibly picky about stupid things. Like I've seen comments like, you know, there's a typo on page, 84, and you're like, really? But it happens. And so there's a lot of low-level critiques by a small subset of reviewers that can hurt you. When you're communicating in these proposals, there's a lot of science that goes on, and a lot of it should be as quantitative as possible. It's important to understand that even really smart people tend to be terrible with numbers. And so this is an example from the literature, which I think is always amazed me, but it's incredibly telling. And people are bad with numbers, especially when numbers are below 1. And so in this case, they took a bunch of psychiatrists, which are highly educated people, and they told them, all right, if you release this patient, 20 of 100 similar patients will commit a violent crime. And 41% of the psychiatrists said, I won't release them. Then they came back with another set of patients and they said, okay, if you release this patient, 20% of similar patients will commit a violent crime. And only 21% of people refused to discharge the patient. So what's interesting, obviously, is 20 of 100 and 20% are the exact same number. And so people don't have good numeracy about small numbers. And so it's often important to provide numbers in multiple formats, because some people understand fractions, some people understand percentages, some people understand decimals. And so you have to make sure that your reviewers are actually understanding your small numbers. Otherwise, you have misconceptions that are going to destroy your proposal. It's also important when you look at graphs to make sure that you control the narrative. This is an example that came from a client who did a project without us, and on the left-hand side was the graph that was originally in the proposal. And in this case, it was a treatment for basically restoring nerve function. And what reviewers said was, your treatment is no better than the control. And which is not untrue, but it was never the point. The point of their treatment was to speed up recovery time. And because they didn't actually highlight that as the importance, the reviewers focused more on the y-axis than the x-axis. And so what they saw is that you got back to 100% no matter what, and so who cares? Instead of focusing on the x-axis where the time was, which is really the value of the product. And so on the resubmission, we annotate the graph to show them really what we're trying to show as the value proposition, and then it became incredibly clear to reviewers. All of you are very small companies, and so that means that you may have very limited resources. And if you think about the size limit, companies of up to 500 employees are allowed to go after SBIRs. And so in many cases, partnering can make you bigger than you are. So particularly with universities, where you can actually get good credentials, good equipment, good brain power to make your project much stronger than it is. And so find ways to find partnerships that actually make you stronger than you are in your own. It's important to also view proposal as an investment, not a binary event. So if you go and you guys go to a pitch event and you pitch your company and investors don't want to invest, you don't crumble up your PowerPoint and throw your company away. Instead, what you do is you learn from that process, you revise your pitch, and you go on to the next one. That's the same thing that happens here. So in most cases, you can resubmit back to the same agency based on those reviews and learn from them. In many cases, you can also find another home and send it to a different agency. So the idea is to sort of capitalize on initial effort as to make sure that you actually are ultimately getting your investment back and not just submitting in proposals that don't go anywhere. One thing that's important to understand is that you can submit the same proposal to multiple agencies. Something that we do relatively often, what I call a 2 shots on goal strategy. So you can imagine that your project is of interest to NIH. You might say, all right, let me send it to NIH and NSF at the same time. Gives me 2 shots to actually get this project funded. Now, if they both want to fund it and the work is the same in both of them, you'll have to turn one of those agencies down. Otherwise, you're probably going to end up in jail. So when you do the 2 shots on goal strategy, it's important to understand you cannot accept funding to do the exact same work twice and get $2 for $1 work. Now, the other alternative is to sort of divide the work into 2 separate projects, and where you sort of say, okay, I'm going to submit, one unique project to NIH, one to NSF that are non-overlapping, and therefore I can accept both piles of money. That, in some ways, is very attractive, but it's also important to understand that it's not terribly difficult to take a good project and chop it in half into 2 completely unfundable projects. And so there's a fine line between, when it's good to go 2 shots on goal versus when it's good to go divide and try to get 2 different awards. It's also important to understand that if you're doing this, the only thing that matters is winning phase 2s. For virtually everybody, you don't need $200,000. You need $5, 10, 15, $20 million. So if you don't win phase 2s, this is a giant waste of your time. It's really that simple. And so it's important to make sure that everything you do is focused on winning phase 2. Obviously, that starts with a good phase 1 that's designed to, change the narrative, climb stair functions in your value proposition, and create interesting data. It also means that you have to be prepared to sort of modify your phase 1 if needed. So you often submit your phase 1 proposal 6 months before you actually get the award, and a lot can change in that time. And so if your phase 1 plans no longer make sense based on prior activity or even during the award, it's very important you go back to the agency and see if you can renegotiate them to make sure that you can be in the best position and pivot to be strong for phase 2 and not blindly follow your phase 2 plans. Secondly, a lot of agencies give you a bit of discretion on when you submit your phase 2. And it turns out there's a inverse relationship between how soon you go and your probability. So, and the issue is that for most companies, their story just gets better and better over time. And so that creates an interesting paradox, because money that comes earlier is always worth more, but generally you'll have more probability the longer you wait. So what you're really trying to do is find the sweet spot where you start to hit the diminishing returns. So imagine you're doing an NSF phase 2, there's 4 cycles a year, every 4 months. And if you're going for, let's say, the next cycle in October, and I told you you had a 40% chance of getting funded, but if you waited until March, you had a 65% chance of getting funded, you'd probably wait till March. If I told you you had a 50% chance in October and a 52% chance in March, you'd probably go in October because 2% is not worth the 4 months. And so you try to find that point where the time loss is not worth the probability gain that comes along with it. Okay, so in theory, all of the agencies care about your commercialization. In practice, they all don't. NSF by far is the most interested in companies' commercialization. A lot of the other agencies have minimal caring for your commercialization. So like for NIH proposals, I would say that less than 15% of the phase 2s that we do we get meaningful comments on the commercialization plans. And the reason why is based upon how NIH attracts reviewers. The vast bulk of them, probably 85 to 90% of them, are academics who just don't feel that comfortable with the commercialization plan. So they focus on the R&D plan. And so in those cases, you're in a situation where I call the research plan is where you're playing to win, the commercialization plan, you're playing to not to lose. And so the issue is that the reviewers don't really know what the right answers are. They know a lot of the wrong answers, but they don't know the right answers. And so it's really a matter of not being wrong more so than being right. In contrast, NSF draws probably their biggest batch of reviewers from prior SBIR awardees. NSF, obviously, they're big on ICOR, customer discovery. They're very commercial focused in their phase 2. And so it's kind of the opposite story. You win with a good commercialization plan and try not to lose with a bad research plan. And so that affects how you allocate your time and where you go from there. Okay. So if you do all those things, you're going to put a phase 1, you're going to win a phase 2, going to try to go to phase 2. I just have some of my own personal thoughts on how you actually mix this up with equity financing. And so generally, before you win a phase 1, you have a team and some technology, and usually no money for most people that we come across. And then you win a phase 1. So then at that point, you have your team, your technology. You have some what I call third-party credibility based on the fact that you can sort of point to this, agency that had a peer-reviewed panel who decided to select your proposal in a very competitive environment, and you have the money. And for most people, I would say that's exactly the first moment you should try to raise money because you have a really, really great story. And a lot of people will come back and they'll say, well, why would I raise money? I have the money from NSF or NIH or wherever. And if you game plan it out, you can imagine 2 different scenarios. One, phase 1 goes incredible, you win a phase 2, probably didn't matter that much you didn't raise money on your phase 1. But what if your phase 2 proposal does not get funded? What's your story then? Well, let's see, you have your team, you have your technology, but now you kind of have negative credibility because you have to explain why NIH or NSF or the DOE didn't want to fund your phase 2. And you also have no money left. And so you're raising money in a very desperate circumstance, which will give you a very poor valuation. Same holds true in phase 2. So you win phase 2. Now you have extra credibility. You have a lot of money in this case, and if everything goes well, you'll end your phase 1 with really great data. You'll be almost out of money, but that's okay. You'll raise money based on that. But if things don't go well, same problem happens. You've lost credibility. You have bad data. Usually, you have no money left. And again, you're raising money on very, very difficult circumstances. And so using your SBIRs as sort of an exciting event to raise money around is a great idea. And again, this goes back to step functions and making sure that you're climbing step functions all along the way to make sure that your company is more valuable, not just because you won a grant. Okay, so if you do all this and you win an award, I like to say your problems are just beginning. And so the important thing to understand is that this is not a case where you won the lottery and a big check slips over your house. Instead, you're entering into a contractual obligation with the federal government. And that does, while it's non-dilutive, it does come with strings. The most obvious one is government data rights. So it turns out that anytime the government pays for research, they have the right to use IP created by their money, royalty-free forever for government use, which sounds pretty bad. In practice, it's not that bad. One, they're called march-in rights. There's really no precedent for the government using their march-in rights. I think they're there for 2 reasons. One, no one wants to tell taxpayers that the federal government spends $100 billion plus a year on R&D and gets nothing in return. And 2, in the event that there was something so critical to the national security and you refuse to make it available, at a certain point, they would probably step in and use their rights. And also understand that these same restrictions apply to universities, anyone who gets government R&D. So they're not a barrier. It's also something where you can, if you're planning this properly, can build a strategy that mitigates the government's data rights completely. So I like to use the analogy of building a car. So let's pretend that I want the federal government to pay for almost everything that goes into building a car, inventing all the technologies. So what I would do is I would allow the federal government to pay for the vast majority of it: engines, transmissions, seat belts, brakes, you name it. But I would make sure that there was one critical part that no government dollar ever touched, let's say the wheel. And that way, even if they want to use their rights, they still have to go through me to get the ultimate value of what I'm creating. And so I basically neutralize the problem of some future where the government wants to use their rights more so than they do now, which is right now they never use it. Okay, secondly, government accounting rules. There are a large stack of regulations about how government dollars have to be accounted for. They're really meant for the Berkeleys and the Lockheed Martins of the world, but they apply to everybody. And they create a bunch of rules about how you have to account for things, and there are significant consequences of not doing things properly. And so essentially you have to maintain a full audit trail of everything that the government pays for, from source of expense all the way through your books. Historically, where SBIR companies get in trouble is around labor. The only way to prove that labor was spent on the grant is to keep timesheets. So you're required to keep timesheets that are updated daily on how people spend their time. If you do not do that, and you are one of the small number of companies that get audited, this goes one of two ways. There's the good way. The good way is they say, where's your timesheet to validate the salary you spent on the grant? And you say, we don't have any. And they say, okay, well, you can't prove that that was a grant expenditure. We want you to repay that money. That's the good version. And there's the bad version. The bad version is exactly the same, except when they get done telling you that, they go, oh, and by the way, we're going to prosecute you as well and try to throw you in jail. So it's important to make sure that you follow all the rules, keep timesheets, keep full audit trails so you don't get yourself in trouble.
Oh, Kirk, can I jump in with a quick question in the chat?
You may, yes.
Yeah, this is from Maria. She wrote, NIH has a preliminary section data and it plays a key role. NSF does not have a section for preliminary data. Could you please comment what is the best strategy for NSF?
Yes. So preliminary data plays a massive role no matter where you're going. It's more important in NIH, but it plays a big role everywhere. And generally, you're trying to incorporate your preliminary data wherever it makes the most sense. So for instance, on an NSF proposal, there's some data that gets to the heart of my innovation. And then I would actually include that in what's called the technical merits section, where you talk about why your technology is innovative. Whereas there's other data which might show that I actually have demonstrated maybe methodology. So for instance, imagine I'm developing a new medical device, and in the process, I had to create a new surgical model of animal model. The data showing my animal model is valid doesn't really get to the heart of my innovation. So I put that probably down in my work plan in the intellectual merit section, not up in where the innovation is. So you always want to include preliminary data. You want to highlight it as early on in the proposal, like an NSF proposal on that first page, it's called the elevator pitch. You want to highlight some of the key points there early on. And you want to incorporate that throughout your proposal to sort of show that you are not an idea, you are technology. So preliminary data is always, always important. Okay. Back to where it was, reporting requirements. Every agency will require you to actually submit reports, and that can be anywhere from once a year, like an NIH, once every 6 months at NSF, and in some DoD contracts, it can be once a month. So that imposes a sort of technical administrative burden of writing up technical reports on a regular basis. And those reports are sometimes tied to cash flow issues. So grants are funded one of two ways. They're either a grant or they're a contract. If it's a contract, and the Department of Defense, NASA, Homeland Security, those agencies use contracts. And when they have a contract, they have to buy something. So what does that mean? What are they going to buy? You're doing early stage research. They're generally going to buy reports. And so in order for them to buy a report, you actually have to do the work first and write the report, which means they can't pay you until after you've done the award. So on a typical DoD contract, there's monthly reports. You will work for a month, have a report due 15 days later. 15 days after that, the program officer should approve it. And then usually 30 days after that, you will get your money. So that means if you do the math out, there's potentially 90 days between when you first do your first dollar of work to when you actually get paid later on. So you have to have a way to deal with the cash flow issues if you have a contract. The next two issues are kind of intertwined. This whole process is incredibly slow, and that makes relying solely on government grants a terrible idea. So this is a typical cycle for the company that just hits it every time, gets all their grants funded on the first try. So they start on a day like today, they plan on working on a phase of proposal. Let's say you're going for that October 26th NSF deadline, you submit it October 26th. Generally, those projects are funded about 6 months later. So that means, let's say May 1st of next year, you're starting your phase one. It runs for 6 months, which brings you through, till the end of October next year. Then at that point, you start to work on your phase two. And that assumes you're going right away. NSF allows you to submit your phase of proposal anywhere from 6 to 24 months after your phase one is awarded. So you submit your phase of proposal, let's say for the March deadline, you wait another 6 months. And that means, sometime in the fall, they're going to award your phase two, which will run 2 years. So if you do the math out, you're now at 4 years. So for most startups, 4 years is like a light year, a million miles away. And you're thinking about it, what are you going to do next quarter or the quarter after that? And the SBIR program is asking you to sort of have this 4-year reality. And that assumes you don't have to resubmit a proposal anywhere along the way. And everything goes perfectly. You don't have to ask for no cost extension, et cetera. So oftentimes in reality, the process might be 5 or 5.5 years. And so when you guys put together your pitch decks and have these nice little stories for investors, they usually don't have 5-year cycles to do $1.5 million worth of work. And so this goes much slower than anything that normal startups work at, which is why it's important to actually have other money to sort of move things along as well, to make this process actually more viable. Otherwise, it's going to take you 100 years to get where you want to go. Okay.
Kirk, two more questions from the chat if you're up for it.
I am always up for questions in the chat.
All right, let's do it. I'll start with Victor. Victor asked, can you comment on whether a company can still apply to the SBIR if they have received some money from a VC fund? It seems as though it's expected to not have any funding source leading into phase one.
Not true. Lots of companies have funding prior to phase one. This is very agency dependent. So most agencies don't care at all. Like, there's no limit to how much money you could have raised as long as you're still eligible for an SBIR. NSF is the one agency that sometimes is a little bit squirrely about this, but you'd have to have raised a pretty significant amount of money. So let's say that you've raised $10 million. NSF's going to say, wait a minute, you just raised $10 million. We have a $270,000 phase one. We're not really moving the needle. So we're not going to be impactful, so it's not of interest to us. But if you've gone out and raised $1 million, something like that, it's not an issue. And in fact, in most cases, it's actually a positive because most reviewers know the government money is not enough to get you where you want to go.
All right, we got a couple more actually. Ash asked, first said, thanks Kirk for the presentation. For the NSF SBIR phase one proposal, apart from demonstrating the technical feasibility, how much do we need to maneuver on showing the commercial feasibility of our project? Any hint in this regard is appreciated.
Yeah, a lot.
Also, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so is Ash one of the people who have gone through I-Corps?
The name doesn't ring a bell for me, but Ash, feel free to unmute and let us know.
Yes, yeah.
Perfect. So when you talk to NSF, what they'll say is they want to fund technical risk, they don't want to fund business risk. So if you don't know, and NSF, they believe in the customer discovery, the I-Corps thing, hook line, they drink that lemonade all day long. So if you don't understand who your customer is going to be, understand your pain points, they're not going to fund that project. And conversely, on the other side of the perspective, like if there's not true technical risk, they won't fund it either. So they want to fund hard problems where they're where the problems are in doubt, but if you solve them, you've already figured out the business dynamics to a certain degree where you know there's a customer out there and you understand the customer's pain point. And so the biggest thing that plays into this, one is having a credible narrative in the commercial opportunity section, but more importantly, there's the letters of support you're allowed to have. So basically, NSF allows you to have up to 3 letters of support in phase 1, and they identify 3 classes: investors, potential customers, strategic partners. I've always viewed the investor letters as what I call letters of last resort, and that's because if they're already an investor, you already mentioned that in your proposal in your company section. If they're not an investor, it raises the question of why are they writing a letter, not a check, if that's a great idea. So I kind of usually tend to skip over that if I can. Letters from commercial potential customers is a big part. So obviously, whatever space there is, you want to identify someone who could be a customer, have them write a letter of support. And then the strategic partner one is really those companies that fall into the awkward category of they could be a competitor, they could be a partner, they could be an acquirer. And so those are interesting letters too, because I think NSF also knows that, if you're successful and you can sell 1,000 of whatever you can do, a big company can sell 100,000 of them. And so, ultimately, more often than not, success pathways are based on an acquisition at the end as an exit strategy than not. And so showing that you can get in the door early on is useful. And was there a second part of that question, Dave?
Yeah, the last question with that was also, how long should the duration of the proposed timeline for the R&D plan?
Okay, so some agencies will dictate that. Some agencies will allow you to choose. So like NSF, you can go between 6 and 12 months. There are 2 dynamics that come into play here. So one, in virtually all cases, well, NSF for sure, it's very easy to extend your phase 1 if you need to. So basically, if you have a 6-month phase 1 and you need more time, you just get a no-cost extension, no big deal, no one cares. Where timing comes into play is really from the review perspective, it only is an issue is if reviewers don't believe you can get the work done in time. And that usually happens when you have experimentation that requires calendar time. So let's imagine that I'm doing a medical device on a chronic medical condition, and I say that I'm gonna, put it in rats and leave them there for 90 days. And I'm gonna run a couple of cycles for that. And if I do that and I'm learning from each one, and I say I'm doing that in 6 months, that makes no sense because I can't run 3 cycles in 6 months. And so they go, wait a minute, you can't do that. And when you make those kinds of mistakes, reviewers kind of feel like you don't understand how complicated what you're doing is, and it kind of blows out your credibility across the board. So in reality, what you want to do is you want to match it to what you think is the closest actual time frame. If you get done early, you can submit your phase 2 early. If you need more time, you can get a no-cost extension. What you're trying to do is make the review timeline plausible to reviewers so they don't ding you for it. So I'm going to do this one last slide. This is my last slide, and then we'll go back to all the questions. And this is just a little bit, again, linked into timing. The issue is that a lot of agencies will talk about, they'll tell you when anticipated award dates are, but in some cases, those dates are just massive lies. So NIH would be the classic example of this. So theoretically, if you submit in April, you should get a project funded in January. If you submit in September, you should get funded in April. If you submit in January, you should get funded July 1st. In practice, the red bars are what actually happened in one particular fiscal year, and this is a very typical year. And what you see is that there's all these awards that are backloaded to the end of the fiscal year. And the issue is that the agency is sort of saying, well, yeah, I got these great projects in April, but I might get even better ones in September and maybe even better ones in January. So I'm just going to sit on these until I see what else comes through. And so you see the first big spike in funding, which occurs in April. It turns out the January proposals are reviewed and scored in March. And so at that point, agencies have a good idea of what their full set of scores look like, and then things start moving out. So just because, don't be surprised if whatever that target start date that the government has isn't really true. And this is true for many agencies. Like, it gets funded when they get around to funding it, and that's just the way it is. So like, we had an NSF proposal. This is an outlier, but it was submitted in December of 2020, and it didn't actually get funded until this April. So really, it was 16 months after submission, which is it's a big outlier, but it shows you how extreme they can be, even though more typical is 6 or 7 months. So the reality is that the timing is always in the government's hands, which is why it's great not to be solely dependent upon this kind of funding. Okay, and now let's kind of cruise into whatever questions you guys might have.
There was one more in the chat from Alicia. Is there any limitation to how many different agencies you can apply to?
No. So, we've had clients that have gotten, funding from 5 or 6 different agencies. The only limitation is really how well you fit with those agencies. And obviously making sure that you're never double dipping on dollars. So you stay out of jail. Okay, so there's a couple other comments in here that I'm going to just kind of speak about. Someone was talking about the project pitch process. I'll comment a little about this. So the project pitch at NSF, about 2 pages. The vast majority of project pitches are approved. Generally, when they're not, it's because they don't see the technical risk. And so NSF wants to make sure that the outcome in phase 1 is in, or you can make the case that the outcome in phase 1 is in doubt. They want to fund something where the risk is just purely technical. You don't want to fund engineering problems that are what I call time and money problems, where it's just like, hey, give me 4 software engineers and some money, I guarantee I can do that too. They want to have situations where you're not sure if you can do it. That's the problem, which is kind of the exact opposite of what like an investor wants to hear. What an investor wants to hear is like, a tech all figured out, I just need money to throw on it and scale it up. What NSF wants to hear is, I don't know if I can do this. That's why we need your money. And so if that doesn't come across in the pitch process, you'll generally get a list of questions or question back from the program officer asking you to clarify what the technical risk is. And if they're not satisfied with that, they'll reject your pitch. Alicia was asking about double dipping. Okay, so let's say that I, as a task in one proposal, say I'm going to, let's say I'm developing a drug, and I say I'm going to, use it in a particular model, a rat model of whatever the disease is. I can't then go to NSF and say I'm going to do the exact same thing. Otherwise, I've asked to basically do the exact same work in 2 different projects, and therefore I get pended twice. And basically it's double dipping on dollars, and that's how you get in trouble. Yeah, so Anna is asking about focus of the grant. Yeah, that's not uncommon. So first of all, at multiple levels. So like when you submit a project pitch, your pitch is good for up to a year. And so oftentimes a lot changes by the time that happens. And I know when companies we work with, oftentimes they've submitted a pitch on their own, which I wish they hadn't. And I'm like, oh, that wasn't the best thing to say. But you do have a lot of latitude to move from where your pitch was. You can't, like, let's say your pitch was on a brand new battery. You couldn't then suddenly do a project on a cardiovascular device or anything. But as long as you're on the same technology, you have a lot of latitude to shift. And when once you've won an award, you can always go back to the program and just say, I want to shift in various ways. The most challenging things is when you need to shift between phases, where maybe phase 1 doesn't actually come out the way you want to. And the question is, can you actually do a pivot in phase 2? That's possible as well. But the kind of thing you want to talk with your program manager to make sure they support whatever that direction that's going in. Someone asked about elaborating to reduce risk for the reviewers. Not exactly sure what that question means. So maybe you want to just maybe type a follow-up question, Maria, and I'll try to go from there. And I can throw my email in the chat if anyone wants to reach out to me. Tony was asking about our success rate. I can tell you what it is, why it matters, and why it doesn't matter. So generally, if you take not us, but all companies, all agencies, phase one success rates around 13 to 14%. It bounces around with the economy. And let's say 38% or so of those projects advance to phase two. Generally, we're in the low to mid 30s in phase one projects and the mid to high 60s in phase two projects, which is useful about us, but doesn't say anything about your project. I view what we do as a multiplier. So if you give me a project with a 4% chance of winning, I'll turn it into a 70, 75% chance. Give me one with a 20, I'll turn it into a 35, 40. Give me one with a 2, I'll tell you don't do it. And so we just sort of multiply what your potential is, and sort of raise your ceiling, help you hit that raise ceiling. Any other questions? Alrighty, so I guess, Dave, we have 2 follow-up sessions for your cohort. That'll be next week and the week after, same time. And that will really be a deep dive focus on NSF, including all the parts of the proposal, budgets, letters of support, bio sketches, everything that goes into it, and how to really make the most of it.
Sounds great, Kirk. Huge thanks to you again for taking the time out to do this. Really, really appreciate it. This was fantastic, and I can tell the group got so much out of it. So Kirk, I'll follow up with you on all of the above, and everyone else who's here, I'll follow up with you all with the share of the recording of this session by later this week. Thanks everyone for being here.
Super. Thanks, guys. Yep.